Welcome to aminacademy.com. In questions, how, why, and what. Regarding that, let's just do the answers for these questions. Does satellite die? Where do old satellite go when they die? Two things can happen to old satellite. For the closer satellites, engineers will use its last bit of fuel to slow it down so it will fall out of orbit and burn up in the atmosphere. Further satellites are instead sent even farther away from the Earth. Two things happen. Like every other machines, satellites do not last forever. Whether their job is to observe whether measure greenhouse gases in the atmosphere or point away from the earth to study the stars. Eventually all satellites grow old, wear out, and die, just like old washing machines and vacuum cleaners does. So what happened when a trusty satellite's time has come? These days, there are two choices depending on how high the satellite is. For the closer satellites, engineers will use its last bit of fuel to slow it down. That way, it will fall out of the orbit and burn up in the atmosphere. The second choice is to send the satellite even farther away from Earth. It can take a lot of fuel for a satellite to slow down enough to fall back into the atmosphere. That is especially true if a satellite is in a very high orbit. For many of these high satellites, it takes less fuel to blast it farther into a space than to send it back to Earth. Burning metal and spacecraft cemeteries. Getting rid of the smaller satellites in low orbit is simple. The heat from the friction of the air burns up the satellite as it falls towards Earth at thousands of miles per hour. No more satellites. What about bigger things like space station and larger spacecraft in low orbit? These objects might not entirely burn up before reaching the ground. There is a solution. Spacecraft operation can plan for the final destination of their old satellites to make sure that any debris falls into remote areas. This place even has a nickname, the spacecraft cemetery. It's in the Pacific Ocean and is pretty much the farthest place from any human civilization you can find. Graveyard of orbits. Graveyard orbits. What does those higher satellites we blast farther away? Those we send into a graveyard orbit. This is an orbit almost 200 miles farther away from the Earth than the farthest active satellites, and it is whooping 22,400 miles above Earth. So, is that end of it for these faraway satellites? As far as you and I are concerned, it. However, some of these satellites will remain in orbit for a very, very long time, perhaps someday in the future. Humans may need to send space garbage trucks to clean these up, but for now, at least they will be out of the way. Now, we'll discuss further about these interesting questions and answers. Does satellite die? Yes, satellite do die. Satellite have a limited lifespan and can become obsolete due to number of factors including mechanical failures. Satellite can experience mechanical failures that cause them to stop working. Technological advances. Satellite can become obsolete due to technological advances. When a satellite is no longer orbital, no longer operational, it can burn up in the atmosphere. Engineers can use the satellite's remaining fuel to slow it down so it can fall out of orbit and burn up in the atmosphere. Be moved to a graveyard orbit. Satellite can move to a higher orbit called a graveyard orbit, where they are kept out of the way of operational satellites. Spin around the Earth. Satellites can spin around the Earth for a while. Be gradually pulled closer to Earth. Satellites are gradually pulled closer to the Earth by gravity and the atmosphere. The lifespan of a satellite depends on its orbit and design. Satellite is low orbit may burn up in several years to decades, while satellite in high orbit can continue to revolve for more than 100 years. Does the satellite need fuel while revolving? No. Satellites do not need fuel to maintain their orbit around the planet. But how it works? Due to other reason. Because once satellite launch, its own speed itself, it's revolve around the Earth. The Earth's gravitational force acts as a centripetal force, pulling the satellite downward and causing it to move in a circular orbit. This is a real fuel. No air resistance. Since there is no air in space, satellites don't have to work against air resistance, so they don't lose energy while rotating. Balanced forces. A centrifugal force is balanced by the gravitational force, so no extra work is required to move the satellite. Satellite to carry fuel, but it's used to change orbit or avoid collision with debris. Satellites also have electricity generation system for equivalent on board, such as solar panels. When old satellites die, they either burn up in the atmosphere or sent to a graveyard in space. The satellite become old. Burn up. Why? When a satellite runs out of fuel or stops working, it will orbit the Earth until gravity pulls it back down. The satellite will then re enter the atmosphere and burn up due to the friction from the air. If the satellite does not burn up completely, pieces may fall into the ocean or onto land, sent to a graveyard. For satellites that are closer to Earth, operators can use the satellite's remaining fuel to slow it down, and send it into the predetermined area in the ocean called the spacecraft cemetery. The spacecraft cemetery is located in the South Pacific Ocean, uninhabited area, which is far from any land and has limited shipping traffic. The 25-year rule is a guideline that operators use to determine whether they re-enter a satellite into the atmosphere or send it to the spacecraft cemetery. This rule states that a satellite should be re-entered into the atmosphere within 25 years if the probability of the injury or property damage is less than 1 in 10,000. The graveyard of satellite is located in the South Pacific Ocean at Point Nemo, also known as Oceanic Pole of Inaccessibility. Point Nemo is the South Pacific Ocean and uninhabited area near New Zealand's Bounty Islands. It is the farthest point from any land, with the nearest islands over 1,600 miles away from the land. Purpose. Point Nemo is a dumping ground for retired spacecraft and satellites. It's been used since the 1970s and has been the site of almost 300 space vehicles. Why it used? The point Nemo is chosen because of its remoteness, remoteness and limited shipping traffic, which helps to reduce the risk of endangering the human life with falling debris. Upcoming events. The International Space Station ISS is scheduled to end its life at Point Nemo in 2021. It will begin deorbiting maneuvers as early as 2026. Scientists don't last forever because of their limited fuel capacity and the harsh conditions of space. The graveyard of satellites is a reminder that even in space, there is a constant effort to maintain the purity of the night sky. So far, we discussed about interesting fact about a satellite. Will satellite die? Where it go after dying? We have done. Please subscribe our YouTube channel.